The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Thomas. Jesus says, "Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. I, too, will become that person, and to that person all the hidden things will be revealed." Jesus says, the kingdom is like a man who had a hidden treasure in his field without knowing it. After he died, he left it to his son. The son did not know about the treasure he inherited in the field, and so he sold the field. And the one who bought the field went plowing and found the treasure. Jesus says, the one who has found the world and has become wealthy should renounce the world. Jesus says, the heavens and the earth will roll up in your presence, and whoever is living from the living one will not see death. Does not Jesus say, those who have found themselves, of them the world is not worthy? Jesus says, woe to the flesh that depends on the soul, woe to the soul that depends on the flesh. His disciples said to him, when will the kingdom come? Jesus said, it will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, here it is, or there it is. Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it. A gospel inspired by God. Once upon a time, and a long, long time ago it was, there was a king in the ancient land of Greece. A king who was very, very beloved of his people, an old man, wise in his years, who brought prosperity to his country and brought peace to his borders. And the people really idolized him. And so once a month they insisted that he come among them so they could proclaim their love for him and their gratitude toward him. So once a month he would go through the main streets of the capital of his kingdom on a donkey. And the people would spread their cloaks and wave palm branches and thank him for the peace and the prosperity that he continued to bring to their land. Every single month on his old donkey. And then one day, the donkey died. And so they had to press a new donkey into service. And so the next day, the king goes out on this new donkey, and he's parading through the streets, and the people are coming out in their thousands with great adulation, heaping praise, and the donkey begins to blush. He can't believe the adulation he's receiving. And it goes on, it gets higher and higher, and finally he begins to nod in appreciation of the praise he's getting. And it gets more and more, and finally he figures he really has to acknowledge this properly. So he stands up on his hind legs and he waves to the crowd, throws the king off and breaks the king's hand. And the crowd set upon him and they beat up the donkey with sticks and with stones. Now, is that a story about a king and a donkey? It's a story about the soul and the ego. The soul is the king, and the donkey is the ego. The ego is that which takes us through incarnation. But the ego gets out of kilter, and the ego begins to think it's the king. And it begins to do damage to the king in the process. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to make 5 main points this morning. I'm going to do a quick recap of the last homily I did 2 weeks ago and some feedback I received from that homily. Then secondly, I'm going to talk about comparing maps and comparing models. And then I'm going to talk about Western models of the self, and then Eastern models of the self, and then finally, Jesus and the great I am. So the other 5 points I'll make this morning. So a brief recapitulation, 2 weeks ago in the homily I gave, I was trying to unpack some of the parables of Jesus that we find in the Gospel of Thomas. And briefly, there were 3 parables. And the first parable, Jesus talked about the kingdom of God is like a woman who's baking for her family. And she puts a little bit of yeast into the dough, and the whole mass rises, and she creates this beautiful bread which she feeds her family with. And I suggested that this was an image of the kingdom in which this woman is nurturing the soul, her own soul, and the soul of the family. And she's taking her life experiences, the yeast, and she's infusing it into the dough of her everyday life in order to transform the whole thing. And she transforms the dough into bread. In other words, she transforms her life experiences into an understanding of the kingdom of God, just for her, not just for herself, but for her family as well. And then the second parable he told about, he says, the kingdom of God is like a woman coming from the marketplace with a big jar of flour or meal on top of her head. And she's walking along, and without knowing it, the handle falls off the jar. Now, the handle is attached at two places to a jar, at the top and the bottom. So now there's two holes, and the meal is streaming out. So the woman gets home and lifts the jar from her head, and there's nothing in it. He says the kingdom of God can be like that. That the life experiences, which is the meal or the flour with which you're meant to transform your life and bake the bread of everlasting life of Eucharist, it's gone because she had been living life totally mindlessly and spilling the contents of her experiences without transforming them into enlightenment. And then the third parable he told 2 weeks ago was of a man in his home who was wondering, can he kill his enemy, a very, very strong man? So he takes his sword and he goes to his own house and he sticks the sword in the wall of his own house to see if he has the strength and the follow through for what he needs to do. And when he finds he has, he goes and he kills his enemy, the strong man. And I suggested that this is a parable in which the house, the wall of the house, represents the defense mechanisms of the ego. And in order to be able to confront society and its shadows, we need first to confront our own shadows and our own defense mechanisms. So this man had to confront his own defense mechanisms, his own boundaries, and be strong enough to break through his own home before he had the courage to go and do the same thing for his culture or his society, to be able to, challenge the shadow material or the shadow side of his culture. So that's what I suggested 2 weeks ago. I got a great email from Tom Thomas as a result. Now, he'd asked a question, we did a discussion at the end of the Mass, and he asked me, what was the point of Jesus using these kind of parables to an audience, 2,000 years before the notion of the ego had been invented, by Freud and by Jung. And I gave an answer to him where I was talking more about the appropriateness of a message to an audience and how the teacher has to be far enough ahead of the audience in order to stretch them, but not so far that he loses them. But that was only a partial answer, and Tom wanted to know, well, what is the point of using kinds of metaphors that are totally meaningless to his audience? And that's the reason I want to address it in this homily today. So this homily is your fault, Tom. So the 4 next points then are addressing Tom's question. It's a brilliant question, really brilliant question. So the first of them is this then. I want to look at what happens when you start comparing models and maps of any kind, of any reality. And when you do it, you begin to see that not all maps have one-to-one kind of correspondences with each other, or not all models, you can't overlay them and see where they have in common. They can be very, very, very different. And I'll just give you 3 examples. If I say to you, I've got a pot of water on my stove, and I put a thermometer into it, and it's showing me 100 degrees. And I ask you, is that water boiling? What's your answer?
It depends.
Ron?
It depends.
Absolutely. Depends whether I'm using Fahrenheit or centigrade. If I'm using centigrade, it's boiling. If I'm using Fahrenheit, it's tepid. Because the boiling point in centigrade, it's a stretch from 0 degrees to 100 degrees. In Fahrenheit, it's from 32 degrees to 212 degrees. So there's a 180 degrees difference in the Fahrenheit model as distinct from the centigrade model. So you can't just put these 2 maps on top of each other and give you a figure. If I give you a figure of 100 degrees, that actually only represents about 38 degrees centigrade if the figure was in Fahrenheit. So you can't just overlay 2 maps and assume that they're going to line up nicely. You need to know where the maps are coming from. Same thing is true of, second example, musical notes. We typically in the West, we learn as little kids, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So we got an 8-note system that then repeats in different harmonics. If you learn your music in Ireland or in India, we use a pentatonic scale. There are only 5 notes in the Irish scale. And so you can map these 2 systems onto each other. So if I sing something in Irish for you, it seems it's kind of off a little bit, which actually gives Irish music a real mystical kind of a tone. If I sing a little song for you in Gaelic, and I say, for instance, Is mahan vani moravor, mahir ordri, Masloshir, Panacher Manadium, Panestiandum Ergacha. You can't transpose that into do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, because there's only 5 notes in the scale. And so it gives a kind of a mystical, otherworldly tone to it. The same thing is true of Hindu music. So you can't just take 2 different maps, put them on top of each other and hope there's a one-to-one correspondence. Third example, languages are the very, very same. The smallest unit of sound in any language is called, linguistically, it's called a phoneme. So a phoneme is the shortest little chunk of sound that you find in a language. And every language has a set of phonemes, out of which their words and their syllables are built. And often, these phonemes are represented by the same letter in different language systems, but they don't have the same pronunciation. So you get all kinds of anomalies. So a native Chinese speaker, if you give them an English phoneme that looks like an R or an L, they seem to transpose them. All these kinds of jokes about flied lice and stuff like that. My belief system is that there's no such sound in the Chinese language that we represent by an R or by an L. There's a sound in between somewhere. And they're actually pronouncing that sound in between. And we hear, because it's not quite accurate, we hear them transposing it when they're not transposing it at all. They're finding a sound which is in between coming from their language. So when you hear a foreign language and you hear a sound which is not native to you, you hear a phoneme that you haven't been educated in, you're not actually going to hear it. You're going to hear the equivalent, the nearest thing in your own language. So I remember making a complete fool of myself at one stage. I was visiting a friend of mine in Holland. And when I arrived in the home, his family asked me, what airport did you fly into? And I said, Schiphol. And everybody cracked up. I said, did I mispronounce it? And they said, yes, you did. And they pronounced it for me. And I heard Schiphol, and they cracked up. So I tried it, I said, Schiphol, and they cracked up again. No matter how many times they told me how to pronounce the word Schiphol, that phoneme is not in Irish or in English. I could not hear it. All I could do was approximate to the nearest sound in the languages that I knew. And so phonemes, you can't map them on top of each other. So there's another example. It is very difficult to map models on top of each other and expect that they're going to line up one-to-one. And that's the problem with spirituality and the problem with psychology. The maps of the psyche that have developed in the West do not map accurately onto deep mystical spirituality. And they don't map on to the Eastern models of what the psyche is. And so, because there's this total miss, we sometimes come to the conclusion that we've got knowledge of the psyche that other peoples didn't have. So I'm going to suggest that, in fact, in spite of the fact that we didn't use the words ego, in 2,000 years ago, the concept was there, and in fact there were much more sophisticated models of the psyche and the soul that you find in spirituality that you don't find in the Western mindset. Which brings me to my next point then. I'm going to look then for a few minutes at when the West talks about the self, what does it mean by the self? And of course it depends on which particular discipline of the West you're speaking about. So if you're a medical, and you're studying anatomy or physiology, anatomy is what the body is, physiology is what the body does. So one is about form or structure and the other is about function. But, mainstream materialistic medical people make the claim that the self merely is that which is revealed by anatomy and physiology. There's nothing beyond that. There's just this spacesuit, this physical apparatus. And this is how it's structured, and this is how it behaves. So the anatomy and the physiology. If you're coming from that model, the self is merely the spacesuit that's carrying you around. If you go into psychology, it depends which branch of psychology you choose to study. If you go into social psychology, and again you're a materialistic scientist, you come to the conclusion that who you are is merely the sum of your social roles, or the relationships you're in, or the job you do. And so you get defined by these kinds of parameters. So when you talk about the self, you're talking about, the job you do, the relationship. I am a daddy, or I am an uncle, or I am a husband, or, I am a bus conductor, or whatever. So we begin to define ourselves by jobs we do, our relationships we're in. So that's a very impoverished notion of what the self is. If you go to behavioral psychology, Skinner et al., they'll tell you that consciousness does not exist. Consciousness is an illusion created by the biochemical activity of the physical brain. But there is no such thing as consciousness. And therefore the whole notion of a self is almost meaningless. You come in as a tabula rasa, an empty slate, and depending on how you're reinforced or punished for particular kinds of behavior, you can be made into anything society wants to make you into. So if you're a behavioral psychologist and you want to know point to the self, the self really is what society has produced out of this empty slate. You're a blackboard on which society has written. So that's a notion of the self in the West. Even when you get to more kind of enlightened versions of psychology, let's say with Freud, the early 1900s, and he came up with the notion that there are kind of the three components of the self. There's the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id is like the pleasure principle, the part of me that wants it and wants it now. And the superego is the censor that says you can't have it. You're not allowed to do that, or you're not allowed to have that. And so it's the censor, and then the ego is the mediator between the two, trying to give the ego, the id, some of what it needs, at the same time make sure it doesn't misbehave culturally or societally. So that was Freud's model of the self. And it was in two compartments. There was a subconscious and there was the consciousness. And the subconscious was really a trash compactor, where you dumped all the stuff you couldn't face in real life, and you dumped it into some part of the psyche, and it came out occasionally, as dreams. So that was his model of the self. If you're a Freudian, that's pretty much who you are. If you're a Jungian, it's a more elaborate model. If you're a Jungian, there are three kinds of compartments. There's the consciousness, there's the subconscious, the personal unconscious, and there's the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious, is peopled by archetypes and complexes. And we often misunderstand. We think a complex is a hang-up. Jung was the person who defined complex. For Jung, a complex is not a hang-up. A complex is a cluster of emotionally associated experiences around an archetype. So you come into the world with the archetype of a mother. Every child expects to find a mother when they come in. And the complex of mother then is all the experiences you have with this woman. So the complex is not a hang-up. It's a whole series of clustered associations to the archetype of the mother. And so for Jung, there are many archetypes, including the self and the ego and the persona and the shadow. So Jung had a much, much more enlightened version. When you say me or myself or whatever, for Jung it was a much, much more complicated model. And so even as you talk about the West, you have to be really careful which discipline are you speaking about when you're talking about the self. They're very, very, very different. So we go on then to what does it look like in the East? When Eastern philosophies and traditions talked about the self, what did they have in mind? I begin with Egypt. Egypt had a model where there's two components, there's two parts. They call it Ka and Ba. One is the physicality of us, the physical, this gross body that we're all aware of. But there's an interior etheric dimension to it. The part that is the template, the energetic template from which this physical spacesuit is created. It's like when you go to an architect and you want to build a home. The first thing you need to have is a plan. And then you bring the plan and you assemble the materials and you get a workforce, and then finally you get a three-dimensional house that you can live in. But you can't get the three-dimensional house unless there's some kind of prototypical plan from which it was constructed. So for the Egyptians, one was the plan and one is the construction. The Greeks had three different parts of the body. So they talked about sarx, soma, and pneuma. So sarx is the physical body. Pneuma is the etheric body, soma is the etheric body, and pneuma is the spirit body. So there's three totally different levels. And I've suggested to you many, many times, you cannot understand Eucharist, or you cannot understand the resurrection of Jesus Christ unless you understand these three Greek categories. When we talk about the resurrection of the body, or eating the body of Jesus, if you're operating from a Western model, this looks like cannibalism, and it's just fairy tales. Cannibalism as far as the Eucharist is concerned, and fairy tales as far as resurrection is concerned. If you don't understand the Greek categories of body, that there's a physical body, there's an etheric body, and there's a spiritual body, then Eucharist and resurrection are totally meaningless to us. But a much more sophisticated model, even than the Greeks, in my opinion, is the Hindu model. And Hinduism suggests there are at least 7 levels or tiers to body. There is indeed this physical gross part. And they're not using gross in the sense of yucky. They're using it in the sense of solid. So there's this solid body, that we can touch and see. And it dies at some stage. It's basically just molecularly constructed. And the molecules dissolve on death and they get recycled into the ecosystem. But there's an etheric body, which is the blueprint from which the physical body was constructed. That's called the etheric body, or the energy body. It's vibrating at a higher frequency. You can only see it if you can see auras. There's a third level of body they call the astral body. And that is the body you inhabit when you dream at night. You're really traveling in another level of yourself, having real experiences at an astral level. And this is the place from which your emotions are downloaded. And it is also the vehicle that becomes the archive of all of the experiences you had during a particular incarnation. When the physical body dies, it gets recycled. The energy body survives for 3 or 4 days, and then it too gets recycled back into the universe as free energy. And the astral body now holds all of the experiences of the lifetime just ended. There's a fourth level of body they call the mental body, and it's the place of ratiocination. It's like Plato's ideal realm. It's where all great ideas come from, that you're downloading, these great ideas. It's a fourth level. There's a fifth level they call the causal body, which is the place at which you begin to discover your psychic abilities. Because literally, we're all part just of the same thing. And so telepathy and clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, telekinesis, all these things are possible because we're all interconnected. So it's not like you're receiving information from elsewhere, it's that we're all the same substance. And so the information comes out in different ways. When you get to that level, information is coming from all parts of it. And it looks like it's psychic activity. It's not, it's the nature of the beast. They also believe, the Hindus, that that is the level of the self in which all experiences from all incarnations are archived. And so, no matter how many times you've been on planet Earth or in other dimensions, whatever experiences you've generated in all those places are archived in this master, library that they call the causal body. Then there's a sixth level, which is Atman, individual soul, the bite-sized piece of God. And then number seven is Brahmanic consciousness, which is unity consciousness. So in the Hindu model then, a particular lifetime is just like a suit of clothes. And you use a different suit of clothes for different reasons. You're going to use a different suit of clothes from if you're going to go swimming, are you going to play tennis, are you going to play football, are you going to go to getting married? You're going to use different suits of clothes. But the clothes don't define you. They're just the appropriate resources for particular kinds of activities that you're going to engage in. But you're not the clothes. So you're the body that inhabits all these clothes. That would be kind of the metaphor for the Hindu model. Now, the Buddha, Gautama Siddhartha, disagreed with this. And where Hinduism talked about Atman, this spark of the divine that moves from incarnation to incarnation, the Buddha did not believe in reincarnation. He did not believe in rebirth or reincarnation. He taught instead an Atman. There is no self. He said the self, in a sense, is composed of what he called the 5 skandhas. And the 5 skandhas are physical form, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. These are like 5 elements. And when you die, these get, redistributed, and others pick up on them. And the best example I can think of this is, imagine you have a little boy who's been given a present of a Lego set. And there's 400 pieces in this Lego set. And they come in 5 different colors. But there's 400 pieces total. And there's a little manual that goes with it. And so firstly, he constructs just a little square building. He uses all 400 pieces, he has this gigantic building, and he's really happy with it. But after 3 or 4 days, because he's a little boy, he's going to get bored, and he'll stomp all over it. And he'll break it up into 400 pieces. And then he'll go back to the manual, and he'll create a super tanker, using the same 5 colors and the same 400 pieces. And now he's really, really happy with his super tanker. But after 3 or 4 days, he's bored with his super tanker, and he tramples all over that. He breaks it up into 400 pieces, and then he decides he wants to build, a Maserati sports car, and uses 400 pieces, the 5 colors, and he builds a Maserati. Now the question the Buddha would ask is this: what happened to the tanker hood of the tanker? And what happened to the house hood of the house that got broken up? All the same elements are present. The 400 elements are there, the 5 colors are there, but where's the tanker hood? It's gone. It dissolved. So it was an artifact of the construction. It wasn't essential to the construction. It it was before the construction and after the construction. That would be the Buddhist notion of the self. So there is no self as far as the Buddha is concerned. There's just this set of 5 constructs that you hold with you during incarnation, and there's remanifestation when you die, but there isn't rebirth and there isn't reincarnation. So when the Buddha, he's talking about a no self. A contemporary of the Buddha would have been Confucius. And Confucius came to the very same conclusion that the Buddha did. Confucius claimed that the self is an illusion created by the sum of your social roles. So in Confucian ideology, everybody is part of 5, he called them the 5 constant relationships. It's interesting he's using 5 as well, but very, very different kind of construct. You can't map the Buddhist onto the Confucianist, even though they both have 5. And so his belief system was, everybody is part of 5 constant relationships. There's the relationship between a husband and wife, the relationship between parents and children, the relationship between elder brother and younger siblings, the relationship between teacher and pupil, and the relationship between the emperor and the subjects. And everybody is caught in the web of those relationships. And the self is merely an illusion created by the sum of these 5 social roles in which you find yourself. So if I were to use an example to illustrate that, it would be the following. If you can imagine that there's a big cobweb up in the corner here, and it consists of concentric circles tied together onto the roof with straight lines. And I say to you, can you see the center of the spider web? And you say, yeah. And I say, can you point it out to me? And you point out to a hole in the middle. And then I start, layer by layer, I start peeling off the concentric circles and the radii that are holding it, and I dismantle the whole thing. And I say to you, where's the center of the cobweb now? And it's not there, because the center of the cobweb was an illusion created by the concentric circles. So that would be the Confucianist thinking, that the notion of self is an artifact created by the sum of your social roles. So there is no you. There's only what happens when when a piece of consciousness finds itself temporarily in a set of relationships. So there was a fascinating study done a few years ago between an American audience and a Japanese audience. And the psychologist went in and he asked, they were sitting in groups, so there's a group of Americans sitting together, and someplace else is a group of Japanese sitting together. And he said to the Americans, he showed them a picture, and he says to them, how does that picture make you feel? And everybody closed their eyes and began to try to access what their emotions were. He went into the Japanese audience, showed them exactly the same picture, and then he said to them, how does that picture make you feel? And the Japanese all looked around at each other, because they can't figure out what they're feeling until they see what other people are feeling as well. Because it's a tradition built on, there isn't a separate self. You're in a set of relationships, and you can't know what you're feeling until you see the expressions on other people's faces. And then you know what it's okay to feel. So it's very, very Confucianist in his thinking. So when we think then about the notion of the self, we can't put these maps on top of each other and think that when we talk about the self, every one of us means exactly the same thing. Which brings me to my final point then. I call it, Jesus and the great I am. I'm totally convinced that Jesus, in time of Jesus, he had a perfect knowledge of what we would subsequently call the ego or the self. And it comes through very, very powerfully in many of the parables he tells. So whenever you hear Jesus tell a parable such as the following, he says, there was a certain rich man who decided to go on a journey, and he put his steward in charge of all his property. And he told me to be back at some stage. But he delayed in returning, and the steward began to lord it over the servants, and to wine and dine and get drunk and abuse his fellow servants. And the master came back finally, and he punished the guy. Now, what does this mean? It is straight out spiritual psychology. The master of the household is the soul, and the steward is the ego. And the ego has responsibility for incarnation. It's the one that organizes our experiences into meaningful pieces, but it's doing it on behalf of the soul. But the steward begins to think he's the master because the master has gone away and isn't coming back. And he starts abusing the householders. So he's abusing his experiences because he thinks he's in charge. That is straight out of a Freudian and a Jungian notion of a self and an ego which is out of control. Jesus will say stuff like, if the householder knew at what stage the thief was going to break in and steal, he'd stay awake. So who's the householder? The householder is the soul. Who's the thief? The thief is the false sense, the false self that keeps misappropriating the property of the soul. That's straight out of a modern psychological understanding. When Jesus talks about another rich man who distributed to his servants, to one he gave 5 talents, to another 3 talents, to another 1 talent, and then he went away. And then he told him, invest it, and when I come back, give me my money back and the interest you've earned in it, or you've generated from it. And you know the story. He comes back, one guy has done really well, the other guy just buried it in the ground. What is this about? One of these guys represents our physicality, One represents our emotionality, and the other represents our intellectuality. They're the three great gifts we get for incarnation. We get a physical body, we get emotions, and we get an intellect. And we're meant to invest these so that when the soul returns and says, okay, let's go back home, we're going back with interest because we've used our experiences in order to grow spiritually. So again and again and again, when you look at the parables of Jesus, he's landing right on that mark, time and time and time again. When he says stuff like, anybody who tries to save his life will lose it. It's the person who's prepared to give up his life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel that finds it. That's a straight-up reference again to the ego and the soul. The guy who's trying to hold on to his life is the guy who thinks he is the ego. And the guy who's prepared to let go of it is the guy who realizes he's a soul and the ego must be in the service of the soul. So when you look at the parables of Jesus, he's landing right on that space again and again and again. So in his own thinking and in the thinking of his time, that is a distinction that's well known to his audience. They totally get it. So let me then talk about the audience itself. When Jesus is addressing any audience, in any audience there's going to be degrees of experience and degrees of intellectual ability and degrees of a spiritual evolution, degrees of athletic prowess, the degrees of musical ability. There'll be a whole spectrum for any audience. There's going to be a spectrum in all these areas. So when Jesus is telling a parable, he's always scanning his audience. He's beginning to see, oh yeah, Eva's really getting it. She's getting the kind of the mystical underpinnings. George is thinking this now, there's a literal. So George is, unpacking it literally. Johanna, that's exactly you, George. That's why I said it. Johanna is getting it symbolically. So his audience are unpacking his message very, very differently. One person just sees a literal meaning to it. Another person sees a symbolic meaning to it. Another person gets the deep mystical core of it. So that's part of what his audience is doing. But when, in general, and this is a kind of an overstatement, when I read through the Gospels, it's obvious to me that again and again and again, the religious authorities and the secular authorities were always on Jesus' case. He was a dangerous character. But by and large, the people were on his side. They supported him. They followed him, except for two major faux pas that he made. Two major faux pas, where he really lost his audience. And the first one is in John chapter 6, where he's talking about the bread of life. He's just fed 5,000 people in the desert with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. But then he goes on and he says to them, that's just bread for your bodies. I want to give you a different kind of bread. And so I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will not have life in you. And his audience is scandalized. This looks like just raw cannibalism. And we're told many of them went and walked no more with him. And Jesus realized he'd blown it. And there's only 12 guys left. And he turned to them and he says, do you guys also want to go away? So he really blew it. He pushed too hard, too fast. And he lost his audience. The second occasion where he didn't just lose his audience, he really infuriated them. There's a discussion going on. And the audience said to him, do you think you're better than our father Abraham? And Jesus says, Abraham longed to see my day. He saw it and was glad. Now, Abraham lived 1,850 years before Jesus. So the audience gets really upset with him. Jesus is saying, Abraham longed to see my day. He saw it and was glad. And they said, are you joking us? You're not even 50 years of age, and you've seen Abraham? And then Christ makes this extraordinary statement. He says, before Abraham came to be, I am. He didn't say before Abraham came to be, I was. He said before Abraham came to be, I am. And at that stage, they took up stones to kill him. They were really infuriated at this stage. He really put his foot in it. So what is the background to that I am of Jesus? And it goes back to an incident in the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verse 17, where Moses is having an encounter with a god at the burning bush. Now, Moses is not a monotheist. Judaism did not become monotheistic for 500 years after Moses, until the Babylonian exile. So he's not a monotheist. But there's this, being, this entity appearing to him in a burning bush, and he wants Moses to go back into the land of Egypt to set the Israelites free. Now, Moses is wanted in Egypt for murder. He's killed an Egyptian. And so he had to escape. And he's living with a group called the Midianites in the desert. In fact, he's married. He married a woman called Zipporah and has 2 sons by her. And her father, his father-in-law, is a priest of Midian. So he's living in the desert with this group. And now, whoever's appearing in this bush wants him to go back into Egypt. And it's a likely story. So finally, when he's run out of excuses, he finally says to this entity, I don't even know who you are. Now, when I go back and I say to the Israelites, your God sent me back to set you free. And they say to me, what God are you talking about? What will I say? And in Exodus chapter 3, verse 17, there's this extraordinary statement. The response is, Ehiyah Ashir Ehiyah, which is always mistranslated into English as, I am who I am, or I am that I am. There is no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You cannot say I am in Hebrew. It's the same in Swahili. You cannot say I am in Swahili. You have to get around it by a device called predication without a verb. So if I say in Hebrew to you, for instance, Ani Melech, that gets translated as I am the king. But in actual fact, there is no present tense of the verb to be. There are future tenses, there are past tenses, there are present tenses of all the other verbs in the language, but there is no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You cannot say I am. So what God actually said, Ehiyah Ashir Ehiyah, is I will be who I will be. He uses a future tense in that statement. Now it's the same as Swahili. If I say to you in Swahili, Mimi mwanaume, I am a man. There is no present tense of the verb to be in Swahili. There are future tenses, pluperfects, past tenses, and there are present tenses of all the other verbs, but not of the present tense. So if I say Mimi mwanaume, what I'm actually saying is me, man, and you have to put the two together. If I say in Hebrew, Ani Melech, I am the king, what I'm saying actually is me, king. And you have predication without the verb. The verb is missing. So you cannot say I am in Hebrew. Now, what is the reason for this? I think there's a deep, deep, deep spiritual realization behind that. And it is this. When you say I am, and then you follow it, I am hungry, or I am sad, or I'm confused, what you're doing is you're making an identification between your isness and a passing state. And you're not allowed to do that. A passing state does not define who you are. It's just the experience you're having. But to say, for instance, I am cold, you're making an identification between a temperature and your isness. And you can't do that in Swahili. In Swahili, what you have to say is, nasikio baridi, I am feeling coldness. But you can't say, I am cold. In Hebrew, you can't say, I am sad. You can't say that. You can say, I'm feeling sad, but you can't say, I am sad. You can make an identification between an emotional state and your isness, or between a physical condition and your isness, or between a mental condition and your isness. You cannot say in Swahili, I am confused. You can say, I feel confused, but you cannot say, I am confused. You can make an identification between a passing mental state and your essence. So that, for me, that is the reason why in these languages you can't use that. So in a sense then, the only sentence in which the phrase I am is valid is when it's used as a complete statement. The only time, the only sentence in which the phrase I am is valid is when it's used as a complete sentence. You can say I am, but as soon as you put a qualifier or a modifier on it, it becomes self-contradictory. As soon as you say I am sad, or I am confused, or I am cold, you've just contradicted yourself. You've begun to identify a passing condition, either physical, emotional, or mental, with the core essence, the Godhood that's at the core of your being. So you can't do it. And so this is why it becomes really, really important. If we really want to understand the self, then we have to start drawing our data from our dreams, from mystical states, from out-of-body experiences, and from near-death experiences. We can't simply draw our data and become cartographers of the psyche as long as we just focus on our physicality, our little things like an ego or a superego, or a need. That's not going to deliver to us. So in some senses, as a better answer to your question, Tom, what I would say is all these categories existed. There is nothing new under the sun.